The transatlantic slave trade was a brutal and tragic part of world history. From the 16th to the 19th century, between 10 million and 12 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homeland and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. This trade was a key part of the global economy, forming the second stage of the so-called triangular trade. The triangular trade system worked in three stages. From Europe to Africa, ships carried goods like arms, textiles, and wine. From Africa to the Americas, enslaved Africans were transported to work on plantations in the Americas. From the Americas to Europe, sugar, coffee, and other raw materials produced by enslaved labor were sent back to Europe. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships were already transporting enslaved Africans to work on sugar plantations in the Cape Verde and Madeira Islands. Spanish conquistadors followed suit, bringing enslaved Africans to the Caribbean after 1502. For the next 150 years, Portuguese merchants dominated the trade, especially along the west coast of Africa. In the 1600s, the Dutch emerged as major players in the slave trade, followed by the English and French in the 1700s. These European powers took large numbers of enslaved people from West Africa, between the Senegal and Niger rivers. In 1713, a treaty gave Britain a monopoly on supplying enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies, leading to a significant increase in the trade. The slave trade devastated African societies. Warlords and tribes were incentivized to capture and sell people, leading to widespread violence and lawlessness. The fear of being captured caused economic and agricultural stagnation. Many of those captured were young men and women in their prime years, severely impacting the growth and development of African communities. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was notorious for its cruelty. Enslaved Africans were packed tightly into ships, chained together with barely any space to move. The conditions were unsanitary, and many died from disease, starvation, or mistreatment during the voyage, which could last from weeks to months. Despite the horrific conditions, some enslaved Africans resisted. Notable revolts included the mutiny led by Joseph Sink on the Spanish slave ship Amistad in 1839. While such uprisings were rare due to the brutal suppression by captains, they were a powerful testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who were enslaved. The movement to abolish the slave trade gained momentum in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Britain outlawed slavery across its empire in 1833 and used its navy to fight the transatlantic trade. The U.S. banned the importation of enslaved people in 1808, and Brazil followed suit in 1850, although illegal smuggling continued until the late 19th century. The transatlantic slave trade left a lasting scar on humanity. It shaped the economies, societies, and cultures of the Americas, Africa, and Europe. The brutal treatment of millions of people for profit is a dark reminder of the capacity for human cruelty, but it also highlights the resilience and strength of those who survived. The transatlantic slave trade was a period of unimaginable suffering and inhumanity. Yet, it is also a story of survival, resistance, and the enduring human spirit. By understanding this history, we honor those who lived through it and acknowledge the profound impact it continues to have on our world today. The Republic of Rwanda is a landlocked country in the east part of Africa. In the early stages of social organization in the region, clans, known as Ubwoko, played a central role. These clans were not strictly defined by genealogical ties or geographic boundaries and typically included members of the Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa groups. Starting in the 15th century, these clans began to consolidate into more centralized kingdoms. One notable kingdom, under the leadership of King Gihanga, managed to unite several neighboring territories, leading to the establishment of the Kingdom of Rwanda. By the 1700s, there were approximately 8 kingdoms within what is now Rwanda. Among them, the Kingdom of Rwanda, ruled by the Tutsi Nyajinya clan, started to gain prominence in the mid-18th century. The kingdom reached its peak in the 19th century under King Kijeli Rwabugiri. He expanded the kingdom's territory further west and north, incorporating several smaller states and implementing administrative reforms. Among these reforms were Yubihake, where Tutsi patrons granted cattle and privileged status to Hutu or Tutsi clients in return for their service, and Uburetwa, a system of forced labor where Hutu were compelled to work for Tutsi chiefs. These changes intensified the division between the Hutu and Tutsi populations. Although the TWA saw some improvement in their status, with some serving as entertainers in the royal court, their overall numbers continued to decline. In 1994, Rwanda was plunged into one of the most horrific events in modern history, the Rwandan Genocide. Over a span of just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 people were brutally killed. This atrocity wasn't the result of foreign invasion but a deep-seated ethnic conflict that turned neighbor against neighbor, tearing the country apart. The roots of the genocide can be traced back to the deep-seated tension between Rwanda's two major ethnic groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi. This animosity was not new, it had been simmering for decades. The colonial powers, particularly Belgium, played a significant role in deepening these divides by favoring the Tutsi minority over the Hutu majority, sowing seeds of resentment that would later explode into violence. The assassination of Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana on April 6, 1994, was the spark that ignited the genocide. His plane was shot down, and within hours, extremist Hutu groups began their well-orchestrated plan of mass murder. The death of the president unleashed a wave of violence that had been meticulously planned, with lists of Tutsi and moderate Hutu targets ready for execution. Propaganda played a critical role in fueling the genocide. Radio broadcasts urged Hutus to cut down the tall trees, a code phrase for killing Tutsis. These broadcasts, along with newspapers and rallies, dehumanized the Tutsi people, making the violence seem justified in the eyes of the killers. The speed and efficiency with which the genocide was carried out were shocking, with neighbors turning against neighbors in a frenzy of bloodshed. As the genocide unfolded, the international community largely stood by. The United Nations had a small peacekeeping force in Rwanda, but it was woefully under-equipped and lacked the mandate to stop the killing. Despite the clear evidence of mass murder, world leaders failed to act, and the genocide continued unabated. The lack of intervention remains one of the most shameful episodes in modern history. When the killing finally stopped, Rwanda was left in ruins, physically, emotionally, and socially. The country faced the immense task of rebuilding not just its infrastructure but also its social fabric. Reconciliation and justice were key to healing, but the scars of the genocide remain deep. The world vowed never again, but the lessons of Rwanda continue to resonate, reminding us of the consequences of hatred and indifference. The Rwandan genocide stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred and the importance of international responsibility. As we reflect on this dark chapter, it's crucial to remember the lives lost and to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again. The world must remain vigilant against the forces of division and hate, for the cost of inaction is far too great.